Hi, this is Stuart, and today we're going to talk about Node.js, Express, and Pug as a quick way to spin up a website. Why Node.js? Super lightweight, it runs everywhere, it's container friendly, it takes very little memory and CPU, so you can get really great densities. It uses asynchronous patterns to avoid I/O blocking and offers the three usual JavaScript suspects, so you can program the way you want, callbacks or promises, or the new async and await. Good use cases. Headless processes, websites and web services, as much traffic as you want, but generally lower payload sizes. Bad use cases are anytime you've got big datagrams that are flowing across the wire, lots of data. I'm talking about not kilobytes, but certainly in the mid megabytes. You definitely should think about maybe A, not doing those over HTTPS or HTTP, and B, probably Node's not a very good choice. But for most regular uses with sane page sizes, it works perfectly well. Here's some critical links to get you started about where to download Node, where to find good documentation, and where the GitHub repo is that accompanies this video. Okay, why Express? Express is a really great unopinionated framework that's got enormous adoption. There's a ton of packages that are designed to plug into Express. The request response pipelines that you build can have just the things you want and nothing you don't. And it works equally well for REST services and websites. And why Pug? So Express doesn't care what view engine renderer you use, or even indeed if you use one at all. But if you want to use one, Pug is a pretty good choice. It looks odd. We'll show you some Pug in a little while. But if you are a .NET person and you use Razor, you'll understand Pug pretty much right away. It uses indenting for nesting, so it's a little YAML-ish, but it always emits well-formatted HTML, and it is a server-side templating language, so it's transformed. So if you are used to something like Razor, you'll understand that as well. By the way, the old name for Pug was Jade, and Pug 2.0 has been out for a little while and is widely used. And there, again, like Express, there are a ton of things that you can add to Pug, controls and things like that. Parenthetically, there are two good patterns for spinning things up that use Node and Express together. For websites, using the Express generator, which is what we're going to demonstrate today. And then you add in whatever else you need and you use your favorite testing tool. The other way is if you're building a restive service, I strongly recommend that you do contract first using editor.swagger.io and the generator tools on that site. And that will make you a Node and Express site all set up to serve your API contract. And then all you have to do is implement your contract methods. You can test using the Swagger UI or your favorite REST testing tool. We're going to need to download Node for our platform. I'm on Windows. In general, we want to prefer the LTS release, which is the stable release. And we want to prefer 64 bits when possible. I've already done this. And the second thing we need to do is go and download the Express application generator. You'll find these URLs in the README of my Git repo. And once we've done that, we just need one more thing, and that is your favorite editor. And I like VS Code. You can download VS Code off this website. I cloned my GitHub site, and I'm going to use the Express generator to generate an Express website. And it's pretty easy. We're going to specify what view engine we want. And for those of you who have seen the old documentation know that the old dash things have been replaced with the simpler V for view engine and C for CSS rendering engine. I like Pug and less, and so I'm going to say make me a website using Pug as my view engine and less as my CSS engine. and I want it to be called NEP Web, which stands for, of course, Node, Express, and Pug. And it's pretty straightforward. I just hit return and there you go, including all the instruction. And I like to take this command and put it into the shell script of my choice, because that will allow me to very quickly start and run my site from the command line without having to remember all the niceties. So let's follow the instructions. Let's cd into the thing. Let's do an npm install. Short is I, and we're going to restore all of our package dependencies. And there you go. So let's go take a look at what the empty site looks like. And there you go. One empty Express site with all the plumbing we need. Opened up our newly created Express project in VS Code. I'm going to go to the Debug tab, and you can see that in the Debug tab, I have some options, and I currently have one set called Launch Program. Let's click on the gear and look at what that looks like. This is Launch.json, which is going to be created by Visual Studio Code in a folder called .vs Code. We have one configuration. It's Node. We want it to launch. It's called, the name of the profile is called Launch Program. And what do we want to launch? We want to launch the starting place for our newly created Express app, which has been www in whatever our current workspace folder is. So let's see this in action. We go ahead and hit F5, and you can see that it will spark up our application. And if we open up a browser window and go to localhost 3000, there is our Node.js Pug demo all ready to go. And in this configuration in Visual Studio Code, I can set breakpoints and run it and see what's going on. Let me take you through the structure of the generated code. So we talked about the VS Code folder that's generated by VS Code. There is a bin folder with a www root file in it. This is actually the place where the application will start. If you're used to ASP.NET, this is equivalent to main CS. In other words, it is the entry point, and it's the only file that actually has an instruction to the shell in it. The purpose of www is to set up a web server that will service your pipeline. And so in this file, you'll find all of the different steps it goes through to set up and start a web server listening on your pipeline. The pipeline is built in app.js, and it starts by creating an Express object and then doing one of two operations. Either app.set, which sets name value pairs that will be used by pipeline components, or app.use that actually injects pipeline components into your pipeline. It's important to remember that these are executed top down, and so the order is important. Here's a couple of key ones. We set the view engine and the view engine instructions in set statements. We set up logging, and here we set up a couple of routes that we're going to use to set the routing later. Form processing is done by the Express.json URL encoded blocks. There's a cookie parser if you need one, the less middleware, serving up static content like JavaScript, images, and style sheets that happen out of the public folder. And then lastly, we put our routes into the pipeline, and then we deal with the fact that we may have bad results. And so we have two generic handlers, one for 404s and one for errors. The public folder, as we said before, contains images, JavaScripts, and style sheets, or anything that will be served up to service the actual HTML pages. If you have no JavaScripts, they should not go in the JavaScripts folder. The JavaScripts folder is intended for client-side JavaScripts. In the style sheets folder, you can see we have a style.s and a style CSS, a combination of VS Code and the middleware for less keeps the CSS file compiled with any changes that happen in the less file.
You can see we have our folder with our routes in it. We'll dig into those in a second. And then lastly, we have our views. Let's start with routes. Here's the simplest route, the route that serves up our home page. And it's a good example of how data gets onto a page in Express and Pug. So we require Express. We get an instance of a router object from Express. And then we declare using get, post, put, and so on, our handler functions. Notice that our handler functions are going to be relative to the path that was specified in the handlers in app.js. Let's look at that again. So here is the get handler for the home page, and here is that router that we're looking at being used, and it's specifying what the relative path is that is attached to. So in this case, if we say app use slash and on our index router, and then our handler says slash, what we're saying is relative to the relative path that was set up for us is part of the middleware, this is what we're going to serve. In other words, slash slash would end up being just the root. The next thing that's interesting about routers in Express is you can have one or more routers in one of several configurations, all of which you can mix and match. Here's the most basic one. You have an anonymous function that gets the request, the response, and the next objects. Next is an interesting pipeline component that effectively allows you to invoke the next handler in the chain. By convention, we include it in our handlers, but in truth, in most cases, they're not needed. We invoke response.render, so res.render, and render will invoke the view engine that we specified, the name of the view, and we'll show you how those are resolved in a minute. And then you pass in a JSON datagram of whatever data you want merged with the form. Remember that data merging is happening server side. And then, of course, we need to export our router so that we have it. You can put more than one router handler method in a particular module, and generally you group like things together in the same way that you group like methods together in a controller in ASP.NET. Okay, so we're going to render the index view. So where is that found? In the views folder. And we're going to go find because our view rendering engine is Pug, it's going to go look for index Pug. Let's look at that. So here is Pug. It's a little odd. First thing in the statement is extends layout. And this is just like specifying in Razor what the base page is. And it serves exactly the same purpose. And just like blocks in Razor, blocks in Pug are replaceable units. So in this case, this is just the body part of our page. And you can see we're using a little bootstrap form magic to make a nicely formed card on our page. Let's take a look at that, and so you can see what that looks like. By the way, at this point, I have actually finished out the demo by adding functionality into it so I can walk you through it. So we're going to press F5 and launch and go to our web page. And you can see that the body part has been rendered. That corresponds to this block, but there's a header and a footer. Those things, of course, are in layout. Let's look at that. Here's layout. And here's the thing about Pug. The indentation is what tells it what elements are inside of what elements. So HTML and doc type are all the way to the left. And that means doc type's not indented under anything, and neither is HTML. But inside HTML, we have two indented sections, head and body. In the head section, we do all of the things that you might want to do in the head of any page. In this case, we're setting up for Bootstrap. We're putting some no cache headers on. We set up jQuery. We set up Bootstrap. We set up the style sheets for Bootstrap. And then, of course, we set up our own style sheet. And then we have our body element. And in our body element, we have a nice Bootstrap for nav bar, very simple, with the icon that you see and the message, and that's this part that you're seeing right here. And we have a block that says this is where our main body is going to go. In this case, the block's called content by convention. And then we have a block for the footer. And it's important to notice that because we put the footer in a block element, we could, if we wanted to, on a page-by-page basis, replace the footer with our own custom footer. Pug uses inheritance just like Razor, so you can have as many layers deep of Pug as you want, and the Pug rendering engine walks backwards till it finds the thing with no references, and then builds up the page based on that, and then invokes any Pug directives that are on the page to do any actions, as in Razor, if we have iterations or conditionals or whatever, and we'll show you some of those. Then Pug does that. Pug then translates the well-formed Pug into well-formed HTML and returns it. In our controller, what we're telling it to do is go ahead and render that. So here we're passing in a datagram of JSON, and we specify a title property. And in our index, you can see that we're consuming that title property using Pug's token replacement syntax. And there's a couple of variations on that, depending on whether or not you're embedding tokens in line, in other words, mixed with the content, as we are here, in which case # brackets is what you do, or whether or not you're assigning them to the inner HTML property of the elements that subsume them. And we'll see that in a minute too. So pretty simple. Main page puts out a header and a footer courtesy of the layout, and then in the block it makes a Bootstrap card in which it provides a hyperlink to a demo form. So let's go look at what that demo form looks like. So here is a simple login or email or registration form, and we can fill it out and hit submit. And on the output page, you can see that we just enumerated the form elements that we captured. By the way, never echo a password back to the screen, but this is demo. And if there are any form errors, we can specify them. And so let's go look at how that mechanism works by looking at the form controller first, and then looking at the Pug that matches this output. Here's the route module for our info block. And you can see that we set up two handlers. A very simple router get, which essentially just renders the form. And in this case, the form, again, is a very simple little Bootstrap form. And I specify what method I want and where I want it to post to. I just have fields in the form. One thing that's a little annoying to people who've used other frameworks is that in order for the body parser to take the response that comes back when the submit button is clicked, you have to have a name property on all of your fields. The ID property is useful if you're doing something with, say, jQuery or some other framework, and you need to identify the form element that way. So once we render the form, and again, we're passing in a title, then we have a method that handles what happens when we post. And notice here that although the form specifies /info/form as its target, in fact, in our handler, we're only specifying the relative path, because when we set up our application routes, we gave it a relative path handler of /info. And so those two things are merged. And again, things are relative to the path that you put in your use statement. Here's where the ability for a handler like route.post to have more than one handler function, and they're executed from top to bottom. And in this case, subtly, I'm mixing the traditional anonymous function with request, response, and next with the fact that you can pass in an array of handlers if you wanted. So I could have made a named function instead of an anonymous function, put it somewhere else in here, and then just added that to the array, and it will process these handlers in order. In this case, we're doing a little bit of express validator magic, and by having it look at the element email and then applying a bunch of validator pre-made checks and transforms to it. There's a check that is email that sets an error state on this element if the element's not an email, it's not well formed. If it isn't, then it will emit this message, and we'll show you how that works. We have a couple of transforms too. We're trimming, which is getting rid of the white space in front and back, and normalizing the email. And then we have another check that's looking at the password field and conditionally checking to see if it meets our strength requirement, which in this case we've dumbed down to just a length requirement. And if that fails, it'll attach that message to that element as well. And as before, we're doing a trim. There's an enormous and rich library of things built into the Express Validator, and lots of other people have added additional types of checks and transforms that you can add to Express Validator to handle your particular scenario. Parenthetically, it also handles sanitization. After we put our form through this gauntlet, then the request object will have those things embedded in them. In other words, we're going to add the metadata from the previous pipelines into what comes back from request. And in this case, the request validator has a method called validation result, which pulls those out of the request body. And then errors map is going to take that and transform that into a schema. And I actually wanted to just get an array of string error messages to display in my form. And then I build a payload that I want to send to my destination form. And I'm going to pass into it the name of the view I want to render, in this case, info.pug. And I'm going to pass in a JSON datagram with 3 data elements: title, the data, which is this info block I'm building up, and my errors array, and we're going to render that. And again, let's go and take a look at the output of that. Here is an array element. You can see my password was too short, and then I'm just spitting out the info block into a table. And so let's go look at what the pug looks like that does that. But you can see that this is a super powerful mechanism where I can have one or more handlers for my form. They chain together top to bottom, and they can be used to do useful work, as in this case, validation and sanitation. So let's go look at the output form. Again, we have extends layout and our block content block, which we indent everything underneath. We set the title of our page. And then here is the power of Pug. Just like in Razor, you can say, okay, well, if this array length is greater than 0, then I want to render this block. And if it's not, I don't. And I'm going to build up a card, and I'm going to cycle through my errors array, and I'm just going to build an unordered list out of the error message. If the errors array is empty, this whole region will never get rendered. I'm putting in a little spacing here. Notice this interesting convention of using a bar to indicate what comes next is plain text. And you can see that more clearly as we look at the table we use to render the data. So here is your basic Bootstrap table. You can see that we have table header element, and when we need to put attributes on an element, there are 2 styles. One style is that you can use the name of the element and equals and then single quotes and then either commas or spaces between the elements. But for classes, there's a shortcut where you can just take the element and dot the class names after it. So here we have a table header element. We want its text to be left. And then you'll notice that we have the vertical pipe character that says that the contents of this cell are the literal text that follows. And by the way, I could put elements, data elements into here by using the pound braces syntax. So now I have my 3 table rows, my 3 pieces of data, and you see the alternative syntax for putting data that you passed into your form elements. And that is to suffix the form element with an equal. By the way, it's picky, so no spaces, and then a space, and then the name of your element. In this case, we passed in the info object, which is actually an object with properties. We aliased it to data, and so we have the data.email, data.password, data.rememberme, and we rendered those out in the form. But you'll notice this is beautiful, elegant, and simple. There's a lot more to learn about Node, Express, and Pug, but hopefully this demo will help you get up and started.